Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and as I am drawing near the end of the Elden Ring DLC, and after many others have already beaten the thing, a question kind of remains after all of this. Where does FromSoft go from here? Some of you may have seen interviews with Miyazaki where he says that Elden Ring isn't quite the perfect game that he wants to create, so the question just bears repeating. Where does FromSoft go from here? And there's many different directions that I think they can go. So let's address them, let's lay it all on the table, and hazard a guess as to where FromSoft can really take the next entry. And I think the important thing to talk about first is the pace of the combat. The Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC is very quick, especially when it comes to boss design and mechanics. I'm sure if you actually played the DLC and then you go back to the base game of Elden Ring, or you just watched gameplay from the other Souls games, it looks incredibly slow compared to Shadow of the Erdtree. And while I think it's absolutely fair to say that the DLC for Elden Ring is one of the hardest things they've ever made, I think we've also kind of reached the upper limit, because realistically, when it comes to Dark Souls-esque combat, which Elden Ring has to some degree, should they really even go faster than this? And I would argue no. The DLC in a lot of ways is incredibly punishing to anything that has a long animation, and perhaps slowing things down in the next entry could possibly be the way to go if you're gonna go for this Elden Ring / Souls-like combat loop and feel to it. But that also begs another question: what kind of combat are we going to get? For instance, Bloodborne was a pretty fast-paced game, but the combat was situated and designed for that speed. And with there being a ton of talk consistently about another Bloodborne port or remake or remaster or whatever, just people, myself included, desperately wanting this game to be on PC and at 60 FPS, and we saw how positively received games like Bloodborne such as Lies of P were in the year 2023, maybe the direction FromSoft should go is to create another game like Bloodborne. Maybe not exactly Bloodborne because the IP is held up with Sony, but to take that idea for the combat and possibly even the aesthetic and do something else with it, with its own new IP. Like how Elden Ring isn't technically Dark Souls, but the inspiration is clearly there. I, for one, would love to see something like that. And if you have a combat loop that is more naturally designed on the whole for these faster-paced fights, and if this is something that FromSoft want to continue to do, well, to me, this just makes sense. You can also argue maybe they go something with Sekiro, because Sekiro was a massive success when it came out and still is. And again, when I'm talking about doing another game like Sekiro or Bloodborne, it doesn't need to be Bloodborne 2 or Sekiro 2. It could be an entire new IP, just constructed in a way to be very similar to these entries. Now, Sekiro is a very well-beloved game, but in terms of gameplay, it is more restricting than Bloodborne. Well, maybe not Bloodborne, but especially games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring. That's fine, don't get me wrong, because that's the design direction of Sekiro. The game is constructed on that founding principle that you will parry, and you will counter. But after you see the success of Elden Ring, maybe you want to lean even more so into customization and build variety. We already saw things like the deflecting hard tier in the Elden Ring DLC to give sort of a nod to that Sekiro type of combat, and maybe similar items in the future games will be all we get of Sekiro from now on. It's possible, I don't know how likely that is, as FromSoft, at least in terms of their history, like to have some variety when it comes to the games they put out. Sure, we had 3 Dark Souls games, but we also got Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, and heck, even Armored Core, which we'll get into in a bit. Funnily enough, though, I think the biggest question to ask when it comes to where FromSoft should go from here, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this: how big do you want the next game to be? Elden Ring was massive, and with Shadow of the Erdtree, I think it's fair to say that the world itself wasn't as densely populated in terms of things to do and to discover as, say, the base game. I don't necessarily agree with the people that say that there was nothing in the DLC. There was, but more of it felt empty compared to the regular game. And I think this kind of stems from the way Elden Ring is constructed on the whole, and when you are very early into an RPG, anything you find kind of matters and feels cool to to collect. You have an entire world open to you, so the wanderlust you have to explore every nook and cranny is at its maximum. At least it is for me. But the more you become acquainted with the world, the more you explore, the less likely you are probably to investigate every little individual thing, as, well, expectations and the way the game works just naturally starts to formulate in your head and your subconscious. I may turn over every rock and look at every bush and say Limgrave when I'm first starting out, but by the time I get to the Mountain of the Giants, I kinda know how the game works at this point and what to be on the lookout for. And my need for power gains is kinda less at that point because my build is mostly sorted, so any individual gains matter a bit less. Like, I'm not going to care that much about 1 point of extra strength when I already have 50 or 60 strength, as opposed to if I only have 15. The delta there just ends up mattering, even if you don't realize that it does. It's a natural consequence of a game being like that big, in my opinion, which begs the question, do we go bigger from here, or do we go back to smaller scale? Do we go back to the size of the world of, say, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, or Bloodborne, or even Sekiro, or do we just say, screw it, let's double down on Elden Ring and do something even bigger and better? And in which case, how do you address these core issues, if you really want to call them? I think it's a very interesting question, because I love Elden Ring, and on my second playthrough, it's a bit of a spoiler for a future video that I want to do, but I think Elden Ring has broken into my top 5 games of all time. I love it a lot. But I don't want every game that FromSoft makes in the future to be just trying to capture that lightning in a bottle all over again. I love the level design, the interconnected feel that the world has of games like Dark Souls 1 and 3. And that is the design of a game that I don't want to see just forgotten to the annals of time. I love the world design of Elden Ring, but let's be fair here, I don't think any other game is really topped Dark Souls 1 when it comes to creating an interconnected world, mechanically speaking. For me personally, I prefer the combat loop of, say, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, and Bloodborne to Sekiro, so my own personal preference is that the next game they make is more that style than, say, Sekiro. When it comes to the open world or smaller scale world, I can go either way here. It really just depends on execution. I'm a fan of open world games when they're done right, and I think Elden Ring is a game that does open world right. Relies on minimalistic gameplay design, and really relies on that sense of adventure and grandiose scale that the world has to offer. There's also another element to Elden Ring that I think is not talked about enough, and that is that the build variety in Elden Ring really lends itself to how big of a game Elden Ring actually is. There are so many different builds and playstyles in Elden Ring, and because the world is so big and engrossing, with so many things to explore and just uncover, it gives you plenty of things to actually do in the game with those builds. All the different quest lines that give you various different things. Like, that stuff is really cool, and it's hard to cram all of that into a smaller scale game. That doesn't make it lesser or greater, but I think it's just one of the design elements to Elden Ring that synergizes naturally with one of its most prized and cherished design features, which is its build variety. Well, what about Armored Core? Now, I know Armored Core isn't as big of an IP as the more recent FromSoft games, but I love Armored Core, and I loved Armored Core 6. And from interviews that I vaguely remember they did, they were quite satisfied with how Armored Core 6 performed, and expressed a desire to see the IP continue into the future. And I would love to see Armored Core 6 too, because normally each generation for Armored Core has 2 entries into it. Now, I think Armored Core is like a different, team within FromSoft compared to all the other teams, which would make sense to me. But if we saw Armored Core 6 2 come out before the next, say, Souls-like game they put out, I personally wouldn't bat an eye. I would love that. It's insane how some of my favorite IP in all of gaming right now is just FromSoft games. Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Armored Core, if they do anything in those styles, I'm going to be excited. I just am. Armored Core 6 was an amazing return to form for Armored Core, and in a lot of ways, blew away my expectations for what a modern Armored Core game could be. Does it have its issues? Sure. But to me, that's just gonna give me even more optimism and a stronger desire to see what the next Armored Core game can be if they shore up those issues and make a better game because of it by addressing these issues. Build variety in Armored Core 6 was really cool, but some weapons and the balancing overall felt really out of place, especially at launch. They shore that up, have even more variety in terms of the builds on offer, and at the end of the day just give me more Armored Core. Legit, I would just be happy about that. I'm an easy man to please when it comes to that kind of stuff. Just give me a giant robot with a bunch of cool different components I can swap in and out for my own build, and I'm just gonna be content and happy. I think the future is very bright, but it's also extremely open-ended for FromSoft. They had this cult-like following that even I was a part of for the longest time since the days of Armored Core, but especially Dark Souls 1, and then Elden Ring really put them out on the map. And Elden Ring kind of served as an example for a lot of other games that was just like, this game is this high quality that bucks the trends and notions of a lot of like quote-unquote modern gaming, and is extremely good value for money, that it makes a lot of the other slop, a lot of other companies trying to push out the door, seem worse in comparison, because Elden Ring is just, you know, that dude. And it really just begs the question, where does FromSoft go from here? And this is where I want to hear you all come in. What direction would be your ideal for FromSoft for the next game they put out? Do you want an even faster pace to the gameplay than Shadow of the Erdtree? Do you want to go slower when it comes to boss design? Do you want combat more like Dark Souls, Sekiro, or Bloodborne, or even something different and unique? Because who knows, they could just pull a cat out of a hat and just do something completely different. How big of a game do you want? Something more like Dark Souls 1? Or more open world and big like Elden Ring? Or are you just like me and you just want some more Armored Core because giant robots are awesome? And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again!